This episode is sponsored by PACS, the gold standard in emergency response bags. So when you're working under pressure, you need kit to be both dependable, tough and intuitive, and that's exactly what you get with PACS. Every bag is handcrafted by expert tailors who understand the demands of pre-hospital care, from the high-tech, skin-friendly and environmentally responsible materials to the cutting-edge welding process that reduces seams and makes cleaning easier. PACS absolutely puts performance first. They've partnered with 3M to make perfect reflective surfaces for better visibility, and bright grey interior makes finding kit effortless and fast even in low light. With over 200 designs, PACS bags are made to suit your role, your needs and your environment. And thanks to their modular system, many bags work seamlessly together no matter the setup. PACS doesn't chase trends, their designs stay consistent, so once you know one, you know them all. And if your bag ever takes a beating, their in-house repair team will bring it back to life. PACS are built to perform, made to last. Learn more at pacs.bags.com or head to the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the podcast. Today we're looking at post-cardiac arrest learning and indeed how to close the gap on that learning and turning data into survival with Matt Didcoe. So cardiac arrest remains one of the most scrutinized and resource-intensive presentations in pre-hospital care. We invest heavily into improving what happens in the moment, compression quality, airway strategies, defibrillation timing, and team coordination. Yet one of the most powerful determinants of system performance often sits outside of the resuscitation itself, what we do with the data afterwards. In many services, once the patient is handed over or the resuscitation is terminated, the process effectively stops. Information is fragmented, device data is inconsistently reviewed, and structured debriefing is variably applied. So as a result, opportunities to identify system errors, reinforce high performance, and drive meaningful quality improvements are frequently lost. So at the same time, pre-hospital systems are generating more data than ever before. So CPR metrics, rhythm timelines, drug administration logs, and physiologic trends are all being measured. So the challenge really is no longer data collection, but conversion, turning raw resuscitation data into actionable learning. So layered onto this is an emerging opportunity to also push meaningful information forward to hospitals in real time, supporting earlier decision making in the ED and or cath lab before the patient even arrives. So in this episode, we're going to explore how structured debriefing, post-arrest analysis and better data integration could transform cardiac arrest care from a series of isolated events into a continuous learning system that spans pre-hospital and in-hospital teams. So I'm joined by Matt. Welcome to the podcast, Matt.
Thanks, Owen. It's really lovely to be here, having been such a long time listener. It's good to be here.
It's great to have you with us, actually. Before we kick off with the questions, Matt, could I just get to speak to your experience and maybe current post?
Yeah, so my background before coming into paramedicine was working in IT, so obviously working with a lot of data systems, databases. And then while volunteering for my old jurisdictional service, had an epiphany, realized I wanted to be a paramedic when I grew up and went back and got accepted through their training program. I worked for this jurisdictional service here in Western Australia for a while, moved from on-road into some leadership roles doing aeromedical and road retrieval coordination, infection control during COVID, which was an exciting time, as I'm sure many of your listeners will remember, or perhaps try and forget. And then I moved into a role looking at all of our data in the clinical space as the clinical digital specialist, doing clinical practice guidelines for our service and looking at cardiac monitoring and our electronic patient care record system. Now I work with one of the cardiac monitoring vendors. What we're going to talk about today will hopefully be generic, and I hopefully won't mention anything too specific to us because everyone out there is offering something at this point. And I look at the digital solutions for them as well as some of the hardware.
Let's initially just start with, why post-event learning matters, really. So, cardiac arrest is often viewed through the lens of what happens in the moment. But I guess flipping that narrative, Matt, could you get to maybe unpack for us how much patient outcome is determined after the case is over, and what we can do from harnessing that data?
Yeah, so I mean, listen, The outcome for that patient is mostly decided in the moment, right? Bystander CPR, whether that was performed, time to first defibrillation, and who delivered that defibrillation shock. Was it a bystander? Was it EMS? The CPR quality metrics, as you mentioned, and how we put together our post-ROS care bundle and how that was delivered before we handed them over to the hospital. So this patient outcome is determined in that moment, but what is determined after that case is the outcome for the next 100, next 1,000 patients. So we know for a fact, right, that there's a learning loop that's required. And as much as it's potentially overused, we look at aviation crash investigations and the learnings they bring out. We're very good now in healthcare. I think we've come a long way in a no blame culture and really learning and wanting to improve rather than it being a punitive process. So what we see now is we can really drive a high performing resuscitation system using all of the data metrics we get from these resuscitations to go, where do we need to target our education? Where do we potentially need to change our guidelines and our workflows to optimize the outcome for those next set of patients?
Yeah, indeed, indeed, and as you said, I think learning prospectively is affected by that retrospective case analysis. So you can just really pick apart, the ways in which you can improve the next time you approach the resuscitation. But could I get you to speak to, there is maybe a variable post cardiac arrest debriefing that takes place. Could I to speak to, just in your experience being on the road, why there is such a gap still when the evidence is clear, really, that learning from these cases is so strong, why there is such a variable adoption rate for sort of post cardiac arrest debriefing?
Yeah, you're right. We have really settled this at a science and guideline level, and it's really interesting, Owen. We look at ILCOR, ERC, AHA, ANSCOR. All of them recommend or suggest some sort of structured debriefing. Like that part is very much agreed on at this point. I don't think anyone is suggesting otherwise at this point. And even the most recent ILCOR EIT review suggested that debriefing associated had either no effect or improvements in ROSC, survival to discharge neurological outcome, with no harms identified to the clinicians involved. Some people have been really worried in the past about traumatizing the clinicians involved or putting them back through something really horrible. But I think the barriers now are really more operational and cultural. And I think this is something I've seen as I've been traveling around the world. Service pressures and the pressure to clear, make yourself available again. So you've got somebody going, need you to go green. I need you to be available. We've got call stacking. There's no protected time in most clinicians' days to sit and do a debrief in the ambulance bay or to do a cold debrief even weeks later. You might have to get people in on overtime. That's more time they're having to give to work. So the time is one challenge. Tooling is the other. So as you mentioned, we've got a lot of fragmented systems. We've got an electronic patient care record. I mean, gosh, we've still got some systems using paper-based case records, which makes it even harder. Lining up that with the monitor data, with the crew's recollection, that's very hard to do in real time if a service hasn't invested in bringing those things together. I already touched on the psychological safety. Many services have in the past equated like a review or a debrief with some sort of investigative or patient safety process. And I think, we have moved a long way as a profession from that punitive measure to let's look at system improvement, not just in cardiac arrest, but all types of cases. And the other one is very much facilitator skill. And this is something that Andy Bell, Nick Overington, and Megan Curry recently spoke about on their CPR Clinical Practice Radio podcast, is that a good debrief is a learned skill. Hot debriefs done badly can 100% do harm. And you need some sort of framework and structure to do that. So I mean, if I'm gonna throw the fox into the hen's house here, it's a leadership problem. It's 100% a leadership problem coming from the top down in ambulance services. They need to ensure that time is made. I think most of our clinicians on road want to improve. it's about making sure they've got the space to do that.
So just pivoting slightly, Matt, and looking at just really some of the data capture and the debriefing. And we spoke earlier offline about there is almost a wealth of data now. So in the post cardiac arrest review, you've got CPR metrics, you've got rhythm timelines, you've got airway data, you can capture when drugs were given, the timestamps. But could I get you to maybe unpack for us, what good data actually looks like, and and then we can also talk about how we harness that data to good effect.
Yeah, 100%. And I actually want to take us a couple of steps back from where we were. So you're talking about what the paramedics or the clinicians of whatever skill level are doing there on scene. But especially with the Utstein update in 2024, um, we're really focusing on the entire chain of survival now. And I think it's important when we're going to do a debrief that we do look at that, because the chain is really important. Because, if nothing has happened for those first 10 minutes before we've got there, well, of course, we didn't have a great outcome because no one was doing CPR. So, I think that update was really, really interesting. And we have a whole bunch of data through our system that starts right from that emergency call to the public safety answering point, whether that be 999, 911, 000. Um, so there's a couple of really key things we're interested in as a service. Was the arrest recognised on the call? So there are some numbers that suggest, dispatcher recognition sits around maybe 75%. That's, one in four arrests not being recognised. And in some services, it's recognised, but it's recognised late in the call, which means that we've missed an opportunity. And the biggest driver for that is things like agonal breathing not being recognised, which obviously, ventricular fibrillation often people mistake for a seizure if they're not sort of familiar with what they're looking at. And so those kind of things and how we dig into that mean we can look at, and there's some really fascinating research. Back in 2018, there was some research by the Prehospital Research Unit at Curtin University that partners with St John in a paper called She's Sort of Breathing by Marianne Rioux and colleagues. That was really fascinating because they're looking at the descriptions around gasping, snoring, sort of breathing, that hesitation in describing breathing. And I find it so fascinating. We focus so much on, does adrenaline work? Where should we put our hands during CPR? The fact that we can even, like, we're bringing linguistics experts into the science of resuscitation and dispatch is such a cool thing, because picking up that is a really cool, time to recognition. Some services, and I know that some services in the UK in particular, actually start with the question, even before, phone number and address, is the patient breathing, to try and fast track that dispatch to arrest. Some services obviously still do it the other way around with their case-centric questions. And then, did we do any telephone or dispatcher assisted CPR or AED use? There are still some services in North America in particular where they're not actually doing telephone CPR. And that's a lost opportunity. We don't have good penetration of CPR training through the public. And there are people that hesitate. So being able to coach people over the phone in basic life support is really critical. And obviously we saw the changes to compressions only, or, with breaths if required. Did we use a metronome? Did we send somebody to get an AED? Does our system even know where the AEDs are to be able to activate them? So that's even before we've got to what happens when the crew get on scene, right? And then there's the pieces around, was an AED used? We look, bystander CPR doubles 30-day survival in some studies in a Swedish registry. Was an AED available? Did we get any good SAM, pulse point, community first responder activations? Because they're all really important for understanding how our system and the initiatives we're running work. Then, of course, we get to our piece around the EMS response, and we've got the basics there, the CPR quality bundle. So our rate, our depth, Now, interestingly, previously, a lot of services didn't use dedicated CPR feedback sensors. Obviously, some manufacturers have them, uh, but even when they do have them, some clinicians are hesitant to use them. But what we know is that just sensing compressions through the pads alone and not having a dedicated sensor means we can really only get the rate data. And what we know now is achieving that really good depth, getting full recoil, making sure we're not leaning. All of those things are really important metrics to understand for a service as well to guide how well we're doing resuscitation. We're looking for a chest compression fraction, ideally above 80%. Some of the guidelines say anything over 60 is good enough. I disagree. We should be aiming for as close to 100 as we can get. And then our peri-shock and pre and post-shock pauses. So how long are we off the chest for? Because we know that that impacts our coronary perfusion pressure and that forward flow, which is really important for keeping the myocardium perfused to achieve a really good shock success rate. When did we get a rhythm change? Was the shock timely? Did we actually recognize the rhythm correctly and shock correctly? Those things are all important. Our CO2, CO2 is becoming more and more of a guiding trend for a lot of things and some level of prognostication. How efficient were we giving our drug timestamps? Some monitors, you can mark your times on as well. So it's all in the same record. Others, it's only recorded in the patient care record, but somebody's scribbling it on a notepad or on their glove. And then the other thing that we're seeing more and more really interesting now, pad placement and the transthoracic impedance. So obviously there's a lot of discussion at the moment around anterior posterior placing or AL placing and which one should be first. And we could spend a whole episode just talking about defibrillation science. And I know you've spoken to some people about that already on the podcast. But did we get the correct placement? So, and anterolateral placement, what we often find is that often due to mannequin design and the way, train as we fight, those mannequins have the connector for the simulation pads or whatever a bit lower. So we find that the pad is placed a lot further down laterally than it should be. So have we got correct pad placement? Now that's something that relies on the people on scene. I can't review that easily afterwards, except from looking at the transthoracic impedance data that suggests that, we had a really high impedance on this patient, so the current was having to go a lot further. And then we have the bit after we hand them over at hospital. Well, if we transport that post arrest bit, did we achieve ROSC? Was ROSC sustained? What did it look like at ED? Did we do a cath lab activation? And then the survival to hospital discharge and the CPC or MRI, so the neurological outcomes. For some services, that's really hard to get because of the fragmented nature of our healthcare systems. If we can't close the loop fully on those patients, it becomes really hard to know if what we're doing is working.
So just looking at something you notion towards Matt really is around your recall bias, and I think having the data is so much more of a powerful tool because you can be specific, and to your point about compression rates, time on chest, gaps for ventilation, so just to optimize that compression fraction and indeed the survivability and that continuity. Could I get you to speak to maybe, that compared to what we used to do, which was maybe that almost that soft debrief where you've got maybe more anecdotal, qualitative reflection, but you're not leaning on the data. And now we do have that quantitative data to really lean back on. Could I get you to sort of speak to that and just how we can, I guess in a way, from a high performance perspective, really start to incrementally improve?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one, right? And I certainly don't mean to cause offense to anyone when I say this, but we know for a fact that crew recall is consistently unreliable. And that's not because we're a bunch of liars or psychopaths. It's because these are high acuity, low occurrence events. Most people, unfortunately, have outside of EMS. I think everyone inside EMS knows the truth. But I think there is still this stereotype that all EMS and paramedics do is go to cardiac arrests and zoom around lights and sirens doing jobs like that. Most paramedics, unless they're a senior clinician, a high acuity response or a critical care paramedic or something, are dispatched to these jobs a lot, most crews will probably only see one or two workable cardiac arrests a year. Might go to more cases where there is no reason to start a resuscitation and things like that. But to actually work an arrest and have a viable arrest, it is a low occurrence event for most crews. And so under high cognitive load with adrenaline in a noisy environment with, family members screaming, yelling, crying, the family dog running around or whatever it may be, um, our perception of time is it goes, right? We don't actually recognize the depth and rate that we're doing. Um, we've seen studies that show paramedics overestimate compression depth, get the rate wrong in either direction, and therefore overestimate a chest compression fraction. But I think it's really interesting. One simulation study, and it is just a simulation study, only 10% of compressions were satisfactory when crews actually self-reported high confidence. Um, and that's a simulation study, right? That's not even once you put them in a high pressure situation. Now, real-time feedback. So, those CPR feedback sensors that I spoke about help close some of that gap during the arrest. But that's when having all of that data and being able to bring it together afterwards is so valuable, because then we can actually go, okay, what actually happened on this cardiac arrest? And now I'm cautious to add that data on its own is dangerous as well. It does need to be set in a frame of context. And this is why I always caution when clinicians or managers, patient safety people are reviewing things after the fact in a well-lit office, with their AirPods in, listening to their favorite music. It's very easy if I just look at a rhythm strip or I look at some CPR feedback data and go, oh, well, there's lots of gaps in this. Crew didn't do a very good job. Um, we need to understand the context. Was that gap in the data or in those chest compressions because, the patient's brother, who had received a frantic phone call from, storms into the room asking what's happening, there's a lot of emotions, and then the crew's attention is diverted because they're concerned about their safety because of the way he's barreled in. Now, that's not the crew's fault. And we shouldn't be penalising them for that. It's a very understandable reaction. So context still matters. And that's very hard to achieve just by looking at the data. And some of those things won't even end up written in the case sheet, right? Like when I'm writing a case sheet, I'm probably not going to mention that in there because it's about the care I've given to the patient instead. So there is the need to bring all the elements together to make sure we fully understand that case.
No, I firmly agree, actually. And there is so many extraneous factors, human factors as well, and like you said, external family factors, and lots actually that maybe the electronic patient report form doesn't capture, but they were absolutely, to your point, Matt, present on scene. Because there is now a wealth of data in post cardiac arrest analysis. Bringing that to bear in a meaningful quality improvement way, could I get you to maybe unpack for us, what data is actually meaningful, and how you advocate, that is structured to not overwhelm us, but just, yeah, provide an improvement for the next cardiac arrest.
At this point, I think it's fair to say we're collecting oceans worth of data, right? And we probably use a puddle's worth of that data on a regular basis. Um, especially for our call centers and those using things like AMPDS. There's obviously a lot of audit requirements there. But then does that data from the control room flow through to anything else in the process? And then does the patient outcome data from the hospital come back to us? Everyone's got their own silos. It's so interesting because we have all of this data, and we're not very good at being able to pull it all together into one system because it all sits off in its own systems, and privacy reasons you can't have access to this, and this system doesn't interface with that system easily, so then I've got to pull a spreadsheet. So it's still an area where integration of the data is probably our biggest challenge rather than having it to start with. Um, I think, apart from those call audits that might be done for compliance reasons and for Centre of Excellence or accredited Centre of Excellence for dispatch, um, is our resuscitation coordination team listening to those calls and providing feedback into OCA recognition and, are we looking at our telephone CPR rates? Are we looking at how often an AED was dispatched or triggered from our control room? Are we looking and working with in the system at how we improve bystander rates? And not just the bystanders getting to the scene, but performing CPR, and what's the mismatch there? The UK has done a fantastic job, and I would say arguably world leading with its AED network, right? And the way that is integrated into control rooms. The circuit do an absolutely cracking job. In a lot of other places, it's a very, very fragmented system. And there are some states in Australia where they still don't even have a registry of all of the AEDs in the community. Western Australia's now got something like 13,000 on its network, and Caitlin and the team work really hard on that. But the interesting thing they do is they get all of the data on the AEDs that were dispatched by the control room and follow those cases up, and provide some welfare. But we really get a lot of data back from those. And interestingly, do we get the rhythm data off of those AEDs as well? Because if they've delivered a shock and potentially got ROSC in some cases, which is amazing because the AED is so quickly deployed, those one shock wonders, as we sometimes call them, what rhythm was the patient even in? We don't know because there's nothing on the EMS monitor at that point. But the cardiologists will be really interested in that. So how does our system work around collecting that data? And then where are we retaining that data? Because, well, that doesn't fit into my monitor's data warehouse. That doesn't fit into my patient care record potentially. So where do I put that? Because that's patient information as well. So as I said, a lot of the problem is this siloing of data. And then the other challenge is that there is no structured sort of workflow or review process in a lot of systems for bringing all of that data together. And then who's responsible for actually taking it back to the crew? Do I have a dedicated resuscitation improvement team? Is it relying on a clinical leader who's got 5,000 other jobs to do every day? Patient safety investigations to go and do things like that. Am I relying on them to get that data back? Is something automated? Again, the risk with automating this is the lack of context if somebody hasn't reviewed it. And so that's probably one of the things I caution with people is it's all good and well having this report, having this data, but again, that context piece, Owen, if you don't have that and you just send something back to the crew, that can potentially become harmful, especially if the metrics don't look great because nobody's quantified or qualified, sorry, that as to why that is, and you get this in your inbox the next time you come on shift, and it feels a bit like an attack without it meaning to be.
Yeah, listen, I agree. And to your point, I think context is everything, and delivery is also everything as far as making sure it's actually meaningful data, and actually they're harnessing it correctly. So it's both there's a sense of affirmation when things are done well, but and if there is any gaps to close, that's hopefully done in person. Like I say, it's not an email. It's not just poking holes in people's practice necessarily at all. It's actually harnessing that for the better. So it's delivery is absolutely key in this as well. Let's pivot slightly because we've touched on the debrief element about the consistency of debrief already, and just the importance of that. But Matt, if I could just press you on and ask you really about closing the loop on that communication between pre-hospital care and hospitals. One of the biggest missed opportunities we see is pushing data and actually alerting cath labs. But no, it's not just an alert, it's actually pushing data to the cath lab. So there's not just be ready in 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes, and we've got maybe a STEMI on route with the STEMI. It's actually pushing meaningful physiological data. So it's pushing STEMI data, it's pushing the 12 lead or the 22 lead ECG. Could I get to speak to where we can close the gaps on that real-time data push?
Yeah, listen, I think the technology exists now. Most EMS monitors have the ability, in some form, to do real-time transmission of some data. Speaking to without naming the brand, speaking to my companies, we have the ability to do full-on audio video calls with the live vital signs right next to it. Some services, or some systems, it's just the vital signs or the ECG, or both. But pretty much all of the big players in this space can do it, right? And so then it becomes a case of, again, integration to a degree, because in a lot of places, our hospitals, our commissioning trusts and our ambulance service are two separate trusts, or the ambulance service sits in a different part of the Department of Health to the ambulance service. And then you look at North America, with so many different private providers that might do a county or a part of a province, but not the whole province. So it's about, how do we then get those systems to talk to each other, and agree on a way of transmitting that data that's acceptable to everyone. And the challenge there, obviously, everyone's looking at cybersecurity now. And so what's allowed on the network, what's not. But we know for a fact that, in one study that was published in the journal from the AHA only a couple of years ago, pre-hospital cath lab activation reduces door-to-balloon time by 14 minutes. And that's just in a STEMI case. That's not in a post-arrest case where it might be even more important. So it's so critical. And there was a scientific statement from the AHA that said, basically, pre-hospital information informing cath lab decision-making is critical. So I think, again, it's the system knows that this is important. It's that piece of, how do we all work together? A lot of systems are now at least doing 12-lead ECG transmission, which is great. But where does that go? Is that going to the ED? Is that going to a cardiology team? I know that there has sometimes been issues where the ED team will want to call a code STEMI and a cardiologist will disagree, and then, we'll review the patient in ED rather than just take them direct to the cath lab, which obviously introduces a delay. And then the ED doesn't even have any bed spaces to review that patient because they've got 5 crews already queuing out the door. So then they're having to shuffle things around for this, a high acuity patient. But we know now at least that we can do that early notification and we can get that 12 lead off. But again, some of those other factors, especially when we're looking at whether we are going to go, what was the presenting rhythm for that patient? We need to be able to send that data, not just the current 12 lead ECG, but the hospitals are often interested in, what was that presenting rhythm? Has there been those rhythm changes? And how do we really easily transmit that information when we are also trying to manage a patient in the back of the vehicle? Obviously, we probably hopefully have a few clinicians with us if it's been a cardiac arrest. But for a STEMI, it might just be, myself and my partner who's driving. So how do we try and do all of that data transmission without too much extra work on the clinician that is trying to focus on caring for the patient first and foremost? And so our systems need to be built around that. And live vital signs is obviously one of the things that we find really useful. Got one service that uses this technology to support their clinicians in remote settings as well, especially with a junior workforce. We've seen a lot, especially with COVID, we saw a lot of our senior clinicians around the world potentially leaving, taking early retirement. Nursing certainly saw that as well. And the lifespan on a paramedic is ultimately somewhere around 6 or 7 years due to the physicality and the shift work nature of the job. And so, we have a junior workforce that has not got anyone particularly senior to mentor them anymore. And so using this same technology to provide support from the clinical desk in the clinical hub can be really valuable as well. So it's got a lot of uses right across the span. So for STEMI patients, for other high acuity patients won't be blue lighting into hospital, but also these live vital signs can be a really valuable tool for that remote decision-making support, speaking to a senior clinician to get some support on where should I go with this patient, what should I do with them, Are they safe to leave on scene? Can I get a second opinion on this ECG? Because I'm not 100% happy with it. Something's just not right with it, but I can't quite put my finger on it. There's a lot of value in the ability to transmit data to a number of places.
Yeah, absolutely agree there, Matt. And to your point around, having high fidelity information only helps with decision making, so if there is remittance of data, it can help the receiving clinician or the reach back clinician make more informed decisions rather than just a phone call or indeed just a passage of linear information over time.
And you think about how hard it is, Owen. You've got a phone up to your ear, or you're trying to hold the radio and do that notification to the hospital, and all of a sudden they want the patient's name, star sign. You're like, I've got a patient here that is rather unwell. I'm going to give you the rest of this information when I get there. But imagine they could at least get, often they want the vital signs as well. Imagine they could just be like, I've connected my monitor to you now. You can pull it up on your resus bay and watch the live vital signs and that trend as the patient's coming in to know if you need to get a vasopressor or something ready because the blood pressure looks like it's tanking a bit or something. You could have all of this set up ready to go for when the patient hits the ED without having to spend even longer on the phone with that crew.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, Matt. So just in the adage of time and just pivoting towards the future vision, if every cardiac arrest automatically generated a structured data set and that there was a debrief report sent to both the crew and the hospital team, what impact could you see having on a system-wide performance?
Transformative, right? Like the vision is incredible. And some of the work one of my colleagues, Jason Belcher, is doing as part of his PhD is looking at those debriefing reports. A lot of services in Australia, Ziad and the team at Ambulance Victoria are already doing this to a degree. But what are the things that are relevant to a crew? And how do we share that back to them? But I think the other really interesting thing about a structured data set, Owen, is the ability to compare across a service. And if we make sure we get the same data for every case, that ability to do that system analysis, and now we take that to the next level. Imagine that structured data set is used across all of the UK or all of Australia, or gosh, both. Imagine we get to a level where we do have, same as we do with Utstein, a lot more of these things being agreed at an international level, and we can start really benchmarking and learning from other services. Hey, your chest compression fraction rate last year was super high. How are you training your clinicians around those pre and post shock pauses? Oh, our service seems to be taking a really long time with the pre-shock pause. Is there an issue with rhythm analysis? We're doing anticipatory charging, but then we're still spending a long time off the chest. Is that because our crews aren't confident in the rhythm and rhythm recognition? Let's put something into our continuing education around that. We know most services struggle with time for continuing education and professional development. So if we can make that really targeted based on the data we can get, that's where we find a lot of value here. And having a debrief report that's consistent as well means crews know what to expect. So when they get it and they're going through it, there'll be things they are naturally interested in. And if it's in a consistent format, it also helps it feel like it's not a punitive process.
So just finishing off, actually, Matt, and as we come into land, the final question really would be, I guess, in a way, do you think, looking at quality improvements, is it more about technology or is it about really building a culture where every arrest is treated as a learning event rather than sort of an isolated case, or is it both?
Yeah, gosh. I mean, it's a bit of a false dichotomy, isn't it? But if I was forced to pick, I think culture wins, right? Technology is largely already here. I spoke about, most services have already got a monitor that records some level of data, event flags. Now, the level to which each monitor provides that data, the granularity of it, whether it's got a separate CPR feedback sensor and things. Many services are using an electronic patient report form. Put those couple of services still using paper to the side. Interoperability standards exist and things. And what we've got now with the opportunity to train machine learning modules. I hate using artificial intelligence. It's all just machine learning, which has been around for a very long time. But we have the ability to really start looking at how we can integrate some of that into the system to look at some sort of automation of these processes, and at least spitting out a draft report that a senior clinician or a resuscitation improvement specialist or resuscitation team can review to help speed that process of getting it out to a crew up faster. Implementation science and a culture of excellence and a no blame culture. They're the bits that I think we're still working on. Technology takes the friction out of that learning loop, but culture decides whether the loop actually runs, and that's a big one.
Matt, listen, it's fantastic to just to do a deep dive into this with you actually, and just walk through this. And we will speak again because there's definitely more to go out here. Just before we finish off, if anyone wants to reach out to you, because you do have, you're involved with it heavily at the moment at QI and QA as well within data analytics for pre-hospital care. How can people reach out to you?
Yeah, the easiest way is probably just pop onto my website. There's an email address on there. So it's Matt, mattdidcoe.com, mattdidcoe.com. I'm sure we can put that in the show notes along with a couple of links to some of the things we've spoken about today, like the Resuscitation Academy guide.
Oh, it's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Matt, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and we'll speak to you again soon on the best.
Lovely to chat on. Take care.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.